Ukraine attacked Israel. Week. A series of absolutely terrible events began, connected with Ukraine, Russia, Israel, and the USA. The events cause a gag reflex, an absolutely nauseating reaction, but at the same time they are incredibly revealing and interesting. Suddenly, the newspaper Ukrainska Pravda publishes recordings of Mindich. If you don't know who that is, I'll tell you. He is the closest friend of President Zelensky. So, in the publication, in the conversations, in this absolutely corrupt conversation, Mindich's close friend named Vova is mentioned. Who could that be? Vova. And how is this publication connected to Zelensky accusing Israel of buying stolen wheat? Or is it connected to the fact that Europe, together with Zelensky, decided to steal 90 billion euros? Today I'll tell you about an astonishing statement by Vova Vladimir, who has no political or even logical sense. We'll also talk about how in the Western and European press it's already being reported how the Ukrainian leadership was stealing money intended to protect the population from Russian missiles. Pretty wild, right? So Zelensky accuses Israel. On Tuesday, April 28, the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, publicly accused Israel of buying Ukrainian grain that, according to him, Russia had taken from the occupied territories. Zelensky announced that Kyiv is preparing sanctions against Israel, as if there weren't already enough sanctions against Israel. The Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs summoned the Israeli ambassador for clarification. The reason was a cargo ship, that is the Panormistic, or Panormitic, which anchored in Haifa Bay. According to Kyiv, this is already the second ship in April carrying stolen grain heading to an Israeli port. An investigation by the Israeli newspaper Haaretz claims that since 1923 there have been more than 30 such shipments, with 4 in 1926 alone. Is that true? This is where complications begin. Israeli Foreign Minister Gideon Sa'ar responded that Ukraine had not provided evidence that the grain was specifically taken from the occupied territories. He accused Kyiv of diplomacy through the press. Not providing evidence means there is none. That's what it looks like, right? Why suddenly accuse the state of Israel, which has been helping Ukraine, out of the blue? Well, if not militarily, then medically, with medicine, drugs, doctors, something you can't really prove. And doing this publicly, not through diplomatic channels, is insanely strange. In global grain trade, the origin of a shipment is established by documents, a certificate of origin, phytosanitary certificates, and a chain of bills of lading. If Kyiv has data identifying specific shipments as stolen, it should be passed on to Israeli customs, not broadcast through social media. At the same time, the Haaretz investigation points to the systematic nature of the shipments. The question is, who exactly bears the burden of proof for each specific shipment? In this, Israel is right. Why did Zelensky do this? Well, the reason, to be continued. There may be several. Subtitles by A. Corrector, Yegorova, first. On the third day of a major war, the president needs to constantly demonstrate that he is protecting sovereignty. Well, including economic sovereignty. The story of a friend buying our stolen grain is possibly the perfect narrative for internal mobilization. Against the Jews, it seems. But it's a very foolish move if you want to maintain relations with Israel. That is, with the very friend who is buying our stolen grain, the second one. Overt pressure on Jerusalem. Okay, Kyiv has been asking Israel for an air defense system for years. First and foremost, the Iron Dome and countermeasures against Iranian Shaheds. Israel consistently refused, citing the need to maintain a working channel with Russia. There was none over Syria. Maybe Ukrainians think that a loud accusation is a way to change the political constraints behind that refusal. Or maybe it's because Mindich fled to Israel, and Zelensky is insanely afraid that Israel will extradite him. But this means that quietly, in some offices behind closed doors, Ukrainian representatives are showing evidence to the Israelis, and they say that if Mindich is handed over, this evidence will go to the press. Third, a risky rhetorical parallel, that's what I would call it, comparing the occupied territories of Ukraine with the occupied territory in the Israeli context. Kyiv has carefully avoided making that comparison for 10 years. Now, for the first time, this comparison is being made openly. Zelensky, in fact, puts himself on the same level as those who equate the Russian annexation with Israel's presence in Judea and Samaria. A good Jew, we found one. And this causes absolute and complete astonishment. Zelensky is basically challenging Israel to a fight, like he's beating his chest, shouting, "I'm Tarzan, I'm not afraid of anyone." If it were someone else, I wouldn't be able to believe it. But after a whole series of Zelensky speeches, including at the White House, at the meeting with Trump and Vance, I can believe any stunt from this person. I don't know, of course, he should never have been the head of state, especially a country at war. How Israel responded. Restrained. The IDF did not escalate, but publicly rejected the accusations and demanded evidence. Jerusalem's message is very clear. Trade investigation? Fine. Diplomatic blackmail? No. What did Russia say? Almost nothing. That's in the past. Now, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov refused to comment on the situation, noting that the Kyiv regime should deal with Israel on its own. Moscow is watching with undisguised pleasure. The Ukrainian-Israeli conflict is a gift that Russia will gladly and happily accept. If you want to know what Israel has given Ukraine during the war, I'll tell you what I can, what I know, what I remember. So the claim that Israel helped little is a myth that people repeat without numbers. What was actually done? The field hospital Kahaf-Mir. Kahaf-Mir is a shining star. It was set up near Lviv sometime in 2022, I think, in the spring. In 6 weeks of work there, more than 6,000 patients received help. That's 1,000 per week. In terms of scale, this is one of the largest foreign medical missions of the first phase of the war. More than 100 tons of humanitarian aid. Medicines, medical equipment, generators, food supplies. Israel is not a very big country. That's a lot. 2,000 helmets and 500 bulletproof vests. This is the first symbolically significant delivery of personal protective equipment to Ukrainian rescue workers and civilian services. A symbolically significant step for Jerusalem. And then there were another 1,500 helmets, another 1,500 bulletproof vests, hundreds of anti-mine suits, and 1,000 gas masks, various filtration systems for chemical protection, armored ambulances. By the way, Mercedes Sprinter. The Israelis did it. They bought these Mercedes vehicles and turned them, so to speak, into armored vehicles. What are they called? I think they're called Plezhenriem. Several batches were delivered. They accepted tens of thousands of Ukrainian refugees. By the way, not only Jews among them, which, according to Israeli repatriation law, it's very non-trivial. Believe me, I've spent more than 10 years there in Israel, as they say. What didn't Israel give you? Offensive weapons, advanced air defense systems, operational intelligence data. The reason, after all, is not indifference. As they like to say in Kyiv, well, the main thing for them is to blame someone for not giving. This one didn't give, that one didn't give, all of them didn't give. They all have some terrible reasons of their own and so on, and most of all because they don't like Ukrainians. Sober arithmetic. The Russian contingent in Syria is just a few minutes' flight from the Golan Heights. Any Israeli supply capable of shooting down Russian missiles over Ukraine would immediately be handed over to Moscow and Iran, equipping them with means capable of destroying Israelis. This is not sympathy for the Kremlin. This is about the safety of their own citizens. Ukraine at the UN. Here is a point that is usually omitted in the Ukrainian press. According to the Israeli ambassador in Kyiv, Ukraine votes for anti-Israeli resolutions at the UN in about 90% of cases. In practical terms, this means that Ukraine has recognized the state of Palestine. It voted for resolutions condemning the Israeli occupation of Judea and Samaria, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. It supported and created annual packages of about 15 ritual pro-Arab UN General Assembly resolutions. And only in particularly high-profile votes did Pagazi allow himself not to vote against, no, of course not, but to abstain, citing the absence in the text of recognition of Israel's right to self-defense. I've been thinking maybe Israel should recognize Donbass and Lugansk as one state. Inside Ukraine. Even the Israeli ambassador himself called this an abnormal situation, considering how often Ukraine turns to Israel with requests. Why does Ukraine vote like that? There are several layers of reasons. The first is a kind of inertia, maybe something left over from the Soviet Union. The Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs inherited personnel, reflexes, and the bloc logic of Soviet diplomacy, for which a pro-Arab stance had been axiomatic since the late 1960s. Voting like the USSR on autopilot turned into voting like the global South. Second, strategy. Ukraine, the non-aligned majority. Ukraine demands that Israel join them. Ukraine went to the General Assembly together with the majority of countries, as they say the G77 yes, so as not to end up isolated on their issues, Crimea and territorial integrity. Third, courting the Arab world. Kyiv spent years trying to get support from Arab capitals for the Ukrainian position on Crimea. They never succeeded. The price of this courting was voting against Israel. Fourth, an ideological trap, of course. Occupied territories is a term that Kyiv actively uses for its own agenda. It is ideologically uncomfortable for Ukraine to vote against this term in the Israeli context, which is why it doesn't vote. In other words, Ukraine's position at the UN is not an accident, not a misunderstanding. It's a choice that has been made for years, including during the years when Israel was providing aid. He treated, clothed, and transported wounded Ukrainians in armored vehicles. Where are the relations heading now? In the short term, toward colder relations. Jerusalem will not allow itself to be publicly reprimanded by a country that votes against it 9 times out of 10, but at the same time it asks for air defense. The Kremlin will do its best to fuel discord. Part of the Israeli political class has long been skeptical of unconditional support. Kyiv will get a ready-made argument. See? You see who you are helping. In the medium term, Israel will almost certainly go through a quiet reassessment of the public part of its support for Ukraine. Not a 180-degree turn, no, but the end of an era when any criticism of Kyiv within Israel was considered bad form. Zelensky, who opened this front for some tactical gain, risks finding out a simple thing. Jerusalem is not the kind of capital that can be publicly pressured and immediately ask it for something. Israeli diplomacy has a long memory and grain. Wheat, I don't know, whatever. This is the last topic on which Jerusalem intends to justify itself to Kyiv. Kyiv has lost its mind. What happened on April 28 can only be described as political madness. A state fighting a war for survival, a state physically dependent on a continuous flow of Western weapons, money, and diplomatic cover, has opened a new diplomatic front against Israel, against a country that, despite all its restraint, treated and clothed Ukrainians, accepted Ukrainian refugees, and has so far refrained from hostility. Any public jabs at Kyiv? But all this happened after the money came through and Europe signed off on 90 billion, 95 billion, well, the so-called loan that no one will ever have to pay back. So, the money showed up, I'll buy everything, I don't need your Israel at all. Yes, but by the way, this is happening against the backdrop of dwindling international support. Washington, under Trump, is acting like a manager who's tired of an unprofitable branch. It is at this moment that Zelensky decides to quarrel with one of the few capitals where Ukraine continues to go begging. But we're about to get a lot of money, so we can afford to do that, so to speak, yes. This isn't diplomacy, it's managerial suicide live on air. This isn't the first, it's stupidity. To understand the scale, you need to understand the content. This isn't a one-time outburst, it's a behavioral pattern, as people like to say these days, established over, let's say, 3 years. February 2025, the Oval Office. A public argument with Trump and Vance, an attempt to lecture the U.S. president on geopolitics, result, expelled from the White House without lunch and the collapse of a deal that was already prepared. It took months and humiliation to restore the relationship. By the way, a direct public insult to a person on whom the fate of the country literally depends, said straight to the camera, "Trump lives in the Russian information space." Wow. Oh, wow. Next is the deal on rare earth metals. First a refusal, then a scandal, then the signing. On the same, well, almost the same terms that they previously refused. That is a clear loss both in terms of position and reputation as a negotiator. Yes. Poland 2023. The grain conflict with its largest rear area ally, which turned into a personal insult. The Polish prime minister literally said at the time, "Stop insulting the Polish people." Israel's story today is, well, almost a copy of Poland's. Hungary and Slovakia are engaged in systematic public confrontation with the countries through which logistics and petroleum products pass. Loud scandals have replaced quiet bargaining. The ban of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the Moscow Patriarchate, a decision implemented in such a way that part of the Vatican, Protestant churches, and a significant portion of American evangelicals, which is probably the most important, turned away. The cancellation of elections. President Zelensky's term of office expired in the spring of 2024. Martial law gives the right to postpone elections, but in the public space, this has turned into the image of a president for life. In wartime conditions, while the war is ongoing, no one will re-elect me. As long as the war continues, I will remain president. This is the image that Moscow exploits daily, the dismissal of Zelensky, the removal of the most popular general in the country who is also respected in the West. At the peak of his reputation, in order to eliminate a political rival, a blow to the army and to Western trust at the same time, the attack on Nabu and Sapo in the summer of 2025, an attempt to take control of the anti-corruption agencies, brought people out onto the streets of Kyiv for the first time since 2022. It caused a public rebuke from the European Union. They had to backtrack, but the bad taste still remained. And the constant lecturing tone. The manner of speaking to the parliaments of allied countries, like a teacher talking to first graders. Well, that works once or twice, yeah, but then the allies start to get tired. Many of them are already tired. Each of these episodes can be explained individually by the war, the pressure, the nerves, but together they form the portrait of a politician who systematically confuses temperament with strategy and grandstanding with diplomacy. What's next? Zelensky is losing the support he was already losing. Now he will lose it faster. The scandal with Israel is not a diplomatic incident, it's a signal to the capitals of the world. The Ukrainian president is ready to publicly attack even those who help him if it benefits him at the moment. After such a signal, any capital, Berlin, Riyadh, Jerusalem, Warsaw, will think 3 times before signing anything long-term with Kyiv. The story, in fact, is a famous one. History knows plenty of rulers who lost the war in the political arena, not on the battlefield. What we are witnessing now is a textbook example of how exactly this is done, in other words, how it shouldn't be done. And the most bitter part is that this textbook is not being written by Ukraine's enemy, but by its own president. But at the same time, gentlemen, events are unfolding inside the country. Look, there's a war going on, people are dying every day, and the country is asking the whole world for money. And in a cozy apartment in the center of Kyiv, a balding man with a well-groomed stubble calmly picks up the phone and says, "So, where's our share?" And by our, he means himself, and as the whole country believes, the president. The man's name is Timur Mindich. And today we will discuss a story that shocked Ukraine and horrified Europe. Well, they're stealing money that was supposed to stop Russian missiles. I've already told you about this. They're disappearing. But first, the question, why weren't they afraid at all? Why do people from the president's inner circle, in a country that has fought and is still fighting a war, calmly discuss kickbacks, mansions, and bribes right in the center of Kyiv? The answer to this question is the most important part of this whole story, and we'll get to it. A man whom no one knew, Timur Mikhailovich Mindich, born on September 19, 1979 in Dnipropetrovsk. Of Jewish descent, the son of entrepreneurs. His father died in 2006 in Israel. This is an important detail, and we will come back to it. This name was completely unknown to the general public. He never gave interviews, never appeared at public events, and never held any government positions. A typical private individual, but with very public connections. And his connections were exceptional. First of all, Ihor Kolomoisky, one of the influential oligarchs of Ukraine and the owner of the 1+1 channel. It was Kolomoisky who, in 2008, introduced Mindich to an up-and-coming comedian from Kryvyi Rih. The comedian's name was Volodymyr Zelensky. Secondly, and this is key, Mindich became a co-owner of the Kvartal 95 studio, the very studio that was founded by Zelensky. Until 2019, they jointly owned the companies of the Kvartal Group. When Zelensky became president and formally transferred his share, Mindich stayed. Essentially, Mindich acted as an intermediary, what is called a go-between, between Zelensky and Kolomoisky. He conveyed the oligarch's wishes. When Zelensky won the election in 2019 sensationally in a landslide, Mindich did not become a member of the cabinet. He entered the president's inner circle, not as an official, not as an advisor, just as a friend. The one at whose place Zelensky celebrated birthdays, the one whose apartment hosted informal meetings, where, according to several people, business matters were decided. In other words, the president's bagman. Well, here's what's interesting, and we'll talk about this very soon. It was precisely this complete absence from public view, this shadow behind the throne, that turned out to be his main mistake. His biggest miscalculation, I would say. Because when Nebu started wiretapping his apartment, he said absolutely everything there. He didn't even think that someone might be listening to him. No filter, no caution. He was sure, well, that his friend wouldn't be touched. Can you imagine? Which brings us closer to explaining why we need to talk about Nabu itself. So who are these daring guys who started listening in on the president's closest friend and even his wallet? Without this, the story doesn't add up. NABU, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine. It was established in 2014, right after the Maidan. Not by the will of the Ukrainian authorities, but at the demand of the West. The USA, the IMF, the European Union, they set conditions. If you want money, if you want visa-free travel, if you want European integration, create an independent anti-corruption body. One that is not subordinate to the president, not subordinate to the prosecutor general, not subordinate to anyone in the Ukrainian government. Accordingly, the West approved and, so to speak, helped appoint the leaders. NABU is literally a Western tool for controlling the Ukrainian elite. It is funded, at least partially, through Western grants. The director of NABU can't just be fired. There's a special procedure for that involving international experts. A person under NABU's investigation is in the big leagues: the president, the prime minister, ministers, deputies, the prosecutor general, judges, everyone at the very top. The West wanted to have recordings. The West wanted to have evidence and facts. Well, as we say here, just in case. The Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, SAP, was created as an independent unit to work together with NABU. The same principles: independence, Western oversight, and immunity from political pressure. It was a deal. Ukraine received money and a path to Europe, while the West got, well, some kind of mechanism to monitor where that money was going. In the summer of 25, something absolutely unprecedented happened. In July, the Verkhovna Rada suddenly voted for a bill that abolished the independence of both NABU and SAP, subordinating them to the Prosecutor General's office. That is, in fact, to the President's office. Zelensky immediately signed the law, right away, without hesitation. Without hesitation, he came up with it himself. How was it done? Cynically and deftly. Amendments were inserted at the last moment into a bill that had already passed its first reading, which originally had nothing to do with NABU. And suddenly these amendments ended up targeting the anti-corruption agencies. The servant of the people deputies were instructed to urgently show up for the vote and ensure its adoption. Everything proceeded quickly without proper discussion and was adopted. The Financial Times put it plainly. Zelensky was in a hurry to take control of the anti-corruption agencies precisely because there was an investigation underway regarding his inner circle. The Times called it, "This became the biggest gamble in Zelensky's political life." Politico wrote that Ukraine has not only an external enemy, Russia, but also an internal one. So what kind of enemy does Ukraine have, I wonder? It's the country's leadership, which is seizing more and more power. Politico wrote directly, Ukraine has an enemy. His name is Zelensky. The reaction was immediate. The ambassadors of the G7 countries, not the G77 but the 7, expressed serious concern. Ursula von der Leyen called personally. People took to the streets of Kyiv and other cities.
Крупнейшие протесты с начала войны.
Well, I suspect they were also slightly funded by the same West. And a week later, Zelensky backtracked. The Rada voted to restore the independence of NABU and SAP with a constitutional majority. The president signed the new law 2 hours after the vote. Why did he back down? Because the price turned out to be too high. European integration, loans, and military support were all tied to the existence of independent anti-corruption agencies. The game for Zelensky and his group, I would even say his gang, wasn't worth the candle. But the very fact of the attempt is very telling. Zelensky's people knew that NABU was digging into them, and they tried to stop it. But why, despite this, did Mindich and his circle continue to behave so calmly? Why didn't they keep quiet, shut down the same scheme, or leave? The answer is in the next part. And it explains not only their confidence, but also why corruption in Ukraine flourished with impunity for many years. Why weren't they afraid? The first reason is structural. For many years, Ukrainian corruption operated on the principle of mutual cover-up. There was no one who didn't participate in it. If there was someone like that, they were removed. Everyone knew. Everyone kept silent. Everyone was involved. A journalist who wrote too much risked losing their job, advertising, and access to sources. A deputy who foolishly raised the issue risked ending up in the minority or facing criminal charges. The second reason, information control. The SBU, which is the security service of Ukraine, was monitoring NABU. I want you to realize this. The official security service of Ukraine, which reports to the country's president, the prosecutor general, and so on, was monitoring NABU investigators, not for a specific case, just because. They were monitoring them, meaning they intercepted their conversations, intercepted their correspondence, watched where they went, and so on. They set up complete secret surveillance over the organization that is supposed to monitor whether the government is honest or corrupt. This is not speculation. These are well-documented facts. Someone in the security agencies was leaking information. Ha ha ha. The third reason is the dossiers. In Mindich's back office, 527 folders were found. He ran away so quickly when he was warned that he didn't have time to do anything with them. On officials, on deputies, journalists, law enforcement officers. Some of the materials were marked for official use only. It was a tool of control. You remember, right? FBI. Hoover in America. It's exactly the same thing, compromising material as insurance. If you know everything about everyone, no one will dare to speak out. Well, the fourth reason is war. In the context of a full-scale invasion, criticizing the authorities has become politically toxic. Anyone who spoke about corruption in the president's office risked being labeled a Kremlin agent, a destroyer of unity, an accomplice of the enemy. Yes, even though I have nothing to do with Ukraine, so they've already explained to me who I am, after a couple of leaks from the CIA, which I published. So they've explained to me several times who I am. That's when you live there. It's a powerful tool to shut you up. It worked. The fifth reason, well, a personal connection with the president, of course. Mindich wasn't just a businessman. He was a friend of Zelensky, a person whom the president would meet on birthdays, at his home, birthdays, in Ukrainian political culture, and not only in Ukrainian, it means one thing: immunity. No one will touch a person who has dinner with the president. Absolutely not. That's exactly why they talked about everything in Mindich's apartment, loudly, without speaking in code, without caution. They were confident, because it simply couldn't happen, because it could never happen. Midas. The Nabu operation was named Midas after the mythical king who turned everything into gold. The irony of the name is obvious. The investigation lasted 15 months. This is not a random inspection. This is a full-scale, systematic operation, very secretive, highly classified. Nevertheless, it leaked at the moment when they went to Mindich. In the end, more than 1,000 hours of audio recordings were collected. For comparison, that's more than 40 days of continuous listening. What were they listening to? Mindich's apartment on Hrushevsky Street, right in the center of Kyiv, just a few minutes from the president's office. This is how the scheme worked. The state-owned company Energoatom, I'm giving you this as an example, the operator of all Ukrainian nuclear power plants, it signed contracts with contractors. Huge amounts of money, equipment, repairs, reactor safety, vital infrastructure. According to the investigation, kickbacks were imposed on contractors. The logic was simple. If you pay, you get the contract. And if you don't pay, you lose your supplier status. Work and pay. If you don't pay, you don't work. There is no third option. The damage from just one deal is at least $100 million, I emphasize, dollars. During the war, out of the coffers of a country that is asking the world for money to survive. The participants in the scheme communicated through proton mail, knowing that Ukrainian law enforcement technically cannot get official access to it. Cryptocurrency was used to transfer the money. From Kyiv to the USA, from Cyprus to Slovakia, Poland. Through Poland, they were sent somewhere else. The accounting system was called Manhattan. It was managed by 2 women from the back office. Each participant had a call sign, so that last names wouldn't be used. Mindich was Carlson, the one who lives on Stoli's roof. Advisor to the Minister of Energy, Moronyuk, was Rocket. Director of Energoatom for Security, Basov. Tenor. I don't know. He spoke in a thin voice. He sings. They talked as if they were conducting a military operation. In a sense, that's what it was. Among those involved in the case, Herman Galushchenko had already emerged. The Minister of Energy, then the Minister of Justice. According to the investigation, it was through him. Mindich influenced appointments and payments. The recordings mention that after his appointment to Energoatom, he went to Durkach, a person known for his ties to Russian intelligence services, for instructions. And how does it work there? Alexei Chernyshov, Deputy Prime Minister, in a key conversation between Mindich and Schiefer. They discuss raising 120 million hryvnias for his bail both officially and unofficially. Sergei Sheffer, longtime first assistant to the president, founder of Kvartal 95. His voice is heard on the recordings multiple times, Rustam Umarov. At that time, also the Minister of Defense. The recordings include his talk with Mindich about Firepoint, which produces missiles, no more, no less. According to investigators, Mindich may be one of the beneficiaries of the company. It received major defense contracts. The conversation is about military missiles in a country that is at war, through an intermediary who is suspected of corruption, and finally the most sensitive part. 2 names are constantly mentioned in the recordings: Vova, Andrei. Vova, Andrei. The journalists have almost no doubt. They have no doubt. Vova is Zelensky. Andrei is Yermak, the head of the president's office at that time. There is no direct evidence. But in one of the conversations, Mindich says, "I talked to Vova." He says that's it. Well, and so on. At the same time, there's talk about 4 elite mansions in Kozin near Kyiv. According to journalists, these were being built for Zelensky, Yermak, Chernyshev, and Mindich himself. There's a shared fence between Mindich's and Vova's plots. I wonder, who is this Vova? MPREF said it directly. Now, you can't say that Zelensky didn't know anything. That argument just doesn't hold up. Friends, stop for a second. If you've watched up to this point, leave a like right now. It helps the channel. It helps us bring this kind of material to as many people as possible. Subscribe and hit the bell because the next episodes will be just as important. And write in the comments whether you think this will actually lead to a real verdict or if it will be swept under the rug again. And one more thing. We have a special members-only section of the channel. It's just $4 a month. Plus, we post all kinds of detailed breakdowns and extra videos there, and most importantly, you'll see them before anyone else on the channel. The link will be below this video. Now let's continue, because what's next is the most important part. Because all of this is coming out now. And we're very interested in why it's happening right now. Escape. On the morning of November 10th, 2025, Nebu heads out to conduct searches, more than 70 simultaneous searches across the country. They arrive at Mindich's place. But he's not home, he just left. Strange, right? What a coincidence. And he disappeared. On the same day, Nebu published photos from the searches, bags stuffed with bundles of foreign currency. This became the symbol of the operation. Where is Mindich now? In December 2025, journalists from Ukrainska Pravda found him in Israel, in the city of Herzliya. It's very close to Tel Aviv. In a brief conversation, he called all of this a media attack. He said that he was declared guilty without a trial. In March 2026, Ukraine sent a 24-volume extradition request to Israel. Israel is reviewing it. I think at the same time they are begging them not to extradite under any circumstances. There is no extradition agreement between these two countries, and Mindich himself returns and refuses. Other sources say he occasionally visits Austria. A man without citizenship, meaning without obligations, lives in beautiful cities of Europe and the Middle East while there is a war going on at home. So the question arises, why now? And here we come to the most important question. Nebu had been collecting these recordings since the summer of 2024. Operation Midas took place in November 2025. Half a year passed, and suddenly at the end of April 2026, a new wave of publications appeared. The most sensitive fragments were about the highest-ranking figures, conversations about mansions, rockets, and the president. Why now? The answer requires understanding a fact that almost went unnoticed amid the military reports. At the beginning of 2026, the European Union decided to grant Ukraine a loan of 90 billion euros. 90 is a colossal amount. It's more than the entire pre-war annual budget of the country. When they saw this figure in Washington, it made them think. Seriously, it made them think. The logic of the American side is simple. If Europe gives Ukraine 90 billion, the main lever of pressure disappears. Ukraine can continue the war for as long as it wants with European money, but Washington wants to end the war. This has been stated directly, repeatedly, and publicly, and here is the window of opportunity. The American side has a tool. That tool is the recordings. 1,000 hours of conversations in the president's closest circle about the president. Conversations about money, about houses, about missile contracts, about Vova, about Andrei. Materials capable of destroying a political reputation. Not only in the West, where he is still considered a symbol of democratic resistance. You understand that when Zelensky was at the White House with Trump and Vance already knew about all these materials. Ukrainska Pravda, the publication that releases these recordings, has historically been close to American interests in Ukraine. The logic is simple. Zelensky, do you want those recordings to stay in the archive there? Then join the negotiations. If you keep dragging it out, you'll get the next wave, and the next one, until there's no reputation or Western support left, until they start calling you a thief to your face. These are classic pressure tactics, compromising material as a tool of diplomacy. Only instead of envelopes in dark offices, today it's public leaks through independent media outlets. The Ukrainian publication Strana wrote about this almost openly. The publication of new Mindich recordings is directly linked to the loan from the European Union. So, in reality, there are actually two forces behind these publications. They have different but overlapping interests. They want peace and talks, while the European Union seeks reforms and financial control. Both want to weaken Zelensky's personal power. And both sides have a tool, 1,000 hours of recorded conversations from his inner circle. Friends, if this material has revealed something new to you, if you're watching this and thinking, this needs to be shared, please share this video. This is the most important thing you can do for the channel and, in fact, for Ukraine, for Russia, for America, for Israel. Share the truth. Add a comment sharing your thoughts on the situation. It's important for me to know your opinion. We read everything. Don't lose hope. I understand that this story sounds grim. Corruption during wartime, missile contracts through a fraudulent middleman, a president whose inner circle builds mansions while soldiers are dying, a state that spied on those who tried to protect it. Spying on Nebu, it's disgusting, it's a crime, but pay attention to something fundamentally important. This scheme was exposed. It wasn't foreign intelligence agencies who exposed it. It was Ukrainian journalists, Ukrainska Pravda, Zerkalo Tizhnya, Ukrainian opposition lawmakers, the Ukrainian Anti-Corruption Bureau. Americans don't work there. It's just American money, but not Americans. For 15 months, despite surveillance by the SBU, despite leaks, despite political pressure, there was political pressure. They did their job. And when Zelensky tried to shut down Nabu, people took to the streets, not because someone paid them. Of course, some information was leaked, and so on. But they went out because they understood this is their institution, their country, an institution created to protect them, and they defended it. There is nothing like that in Russia. Many post-Soviet states don't have that either. Not because there is no corruption there. Oh, there is. But because there is no mechanism there, capable of exposing it and bringing it to light. Ukraine, despite all the horrors happening, is showing signs of a real civil society. A society that knows how to look at itself honestly. That doesn't allow the authorities to become untouchable. That is fighting an external enemy. And at the same time, they are trying not to let the internal enemy destroy exactly what the country is fighting for. The story of Mindich, of course, isn't over. The recordings keep being published. The extradition isn't finished. Maybe these publications will make the Israelis hand him over. The question is, hand him over to whom? Yes, if it's to Zelensky's people, they'll get rid of him on the way. There was no trial. The political consequences are still unfolding. But what's happening is happening out in the open. And that alone is already a victory. A small step, but in the right direction. That's all. And I think we'll meet again soon with more news. As always, interesting, astonishing, fascinating, and sometimes nauseating. See you soon.